I'm Dr. Matthew Reznicek from the Creighton University School of Medicine and College of Arts and Sciences, where I teach 19th century British and Irish literature and medical humanities. Today, I'll be speaking about the national tale, disability, and citizenship. Both the political acts of union and the narratives that enact them are about the management of individual bodies. The political unions seek to form, to augment, to control the body politic, while the narratives function as the, quote, prosthetic join which binds us to ourselves, to each other, and to the body politic. In this framework, then, the national tale and the act of union must be understood in terms of the Hobbesian tradition of the body politic, in which the individual body and the collective body of the nation are joined, quote, through the work of political art, a kind of artifice which takes the body out of nature and remakes it as a subject of the state. However, feminist criticism of the national tale has consistently pointed out that the process by which the body is remade as a subject of the state is inherently rooted in violence. Julia Ann Miller insists that the national tales of Edgeworth and Owenson, quote, reveal the violence just under the surface of the marriage that functions as the allegory for the political union. Insisting upon the violence of these political and narrative forms, these feminist interpretations draw upon the logic of Foucault's concept of governmentality, a process by which the inherent violence of Hobbes' Leviathan is internalized through the structures that manage, police, and classify the bodies of the state. The classificatory power of the state is essential in Mary Puvy's conception of the body politic because of its exclusionary power. In her foundational study, Puvy notes that the, quote, social body was constituted through exclusion. The poor were not usually considered members of the body politic, indeed as diseased, unproductive, criminal, plague-ridden members. The poor were considered inimical to the health of the body politic. Pamela Gilbert helpfully extends this claim by tying it to Foucault, arguing that, quote, poverty, crime, and what would finally be termed public health issues came to be understood as, quote, problems in the development of the citizen, problems of individual bad health that threatened the overall health of the social body. For both Puy and Gilbert, the social body is framed not only as an exclusionary site of certain diseased or unhealthy bodies, but also as the site of governmental and state policing of public health. The individual bodies are surveilled and monitored to prevent the spread of disease to the wider public. Thus, the social body is constituted by the bodies of its citizens and by the exclusion of those deemed not to belong. Puvy and Gilbert have argued persuasively that the classificatory boundaries of the social body are intimately tied up with representations of and concerns around illness, disease, and public health. The limits of belonging, that is, are correlated to the conceptions of health and illness. Thus, Jonathan Swift's distinction between a Scotland riddled with 20 ill smells and the itch on the one hand, and an Ireland that is, quote, as handsome as any in our neighborhood, employs this logic of health and illness as the dividing line between the nations that ought to be included in the 1707 Acts of Union, arguing that a healthier Ireland is more meritorious than an ailing and VD-infected Scotland. The same biological or immunological line of demarcation persists well into the development of the national tale in the early 19th century, when it becomes even more pronounced and associated not only with the consistent outbreaks of various fevers and diseases, and thus public health, but also with the metaphorical outbreaks of revolutionary fevers and thus public political health. The national tale then reveals not simply the enactment of the unions, but the biopolitical basis on which citizenship is imagined and granted, the violent exclusion of the ill and disabled in early 19th century concepts of governmentality. As the novels of Walter Scott and Maria Edgeworth demonstrate, the enactment of the political union and the marital union in the national tale exhibits an ambiguous relationship to those figures who would be cast out or denied citizenship in the new union. In Scott's The Black Dwarf, the disabled person is crucial to achieving the personal union of marriage and, moreover, is essential to quelling the Jacobite threat that undermines the stability of the political union. In Edgeworth's Ennui, the political union is threatened by an individual characterized as disabled, but also a widespread illness and fever that infects the broader citizenship. This infected community begins to articulate an alternative political union that privileges the citizenship of individuals characterized by the same disability or illness. Ultimately, then, attending to the representation of health, illness, and disability in the national tales of Scott and Edgeworth refines our conceptions of citizenship and belonging, as well as our understanding of health and ability in the early years of 19th century Ireland and Britain. It has become a critical commonplace to trace the development of disability in the 18th and 19th centuries through the ideological matrix of, quote, liberalism, free market economics, British nationalism, and professionalized medicine. Scholars like Youngquist, Boxall, and Farr find this not least because of the way that citizenship, labor, and identity are connected in the writings of Locke and Smith. The bodily norm, to borrow from Youngquist, that emerges from this intellectual history is one of a, quote, private body whose labor produces property and is therefore fungible, a British body whose health reproduces propriety and is therefore normative. Defining the bodily norm in terms of labor, productivity, Britishness, and propriety, Youngquist argues that the Act of Union of 1707 began a, quote, cultural project of creating Great Britain by attempting to unite a diverse populace into an identifiable population. Walter Scott's The Black Dwarf, published as part of his Tales of My Landlord, not only returns to this inaugural moment of national production, but demonstrates the ways that citizenship is defined in opposition to bodies marked as different, disabled, abnormal. Although the eponymous Black Dwarf is central to the preservation of both a personal and political union, Scott's novel enacts Youngquist's cultural project by expelling the abnormal canny Elshie of Muckleston Moor from the identifiable population. Citizenship in Scott's newly united Great Britain only belongs to certain bodies that adhere to that norm. And this novel focuses on Elshie, the titular Black Dwarf. And the introduction insists that, quote, the ideal being who is here presented as residing in solitude and haunted by a consciousness of his own deformity and a suspicion of his being generally subjected to the scorn of his fellow men is not altogether imaginary. Drawing on medical observation, Scott's introduction provides a, quote, tolerably exact and unexaggerated portrait of the original figure. I'm not going to read this quote because it's far too long, but I'll leave it up for you to read on your own. This rather lengthy and exhaustive description repeatedly emphasizes the sense of deformity, the conflation of physical and mental conditions, and most importantly, the way it attributes his, quote, fierce and bitter feelings to the treatment he has received because of his deformity. The fact that his sense of deformity haunted him like a phantom demonstrates the degree to which he has internalized the alienation and exclusion with which he is treated by others. The introduction adds that he, quote, detested children on account of the propensity to insult and persecute him. His misanthropy, Scott insists, was founded in a sense of his own preternatural deformity. Attributing his misanthropy to a sense of this deformity reveals the internalization of discrimination. In a way, this recalls Michael Oliver's insistence that, quote, disability and impairment are culturally produced. Elizabeth Barnes contends that this characterization understands disability as the, quote, disadvantage produced by social prejudice against certain types of persons with impairments. As Jessica Joshua explains, this formulation of disability as a social or cultural production treats disability as a product of the, quote, rise of capitalism, and with it, an increase in the ideology of individualism. Although scholars critique or refine this understanding of disability, the social model provides an important formulation for understanding the way disability functions in the Black Dwarf. From the very outset, disability is marked not only as other, but as the cause of prejudice. Joshua, building on Oliver's work, claims that the social model of disability reveals the role that the ideology of individualism plays, ultimately conceiving of disability as the antithesis of the, quote, requirements of the labor market, disguises the reality that we all live in a state of mutual interdependence. The model of disability that Scott lays out from the outset of his novel sets individualism and able-bodiedness in opposition to a state of mutual interdependence that undermines the liberal conception of citizenship. In the preface to Tales of Fashionable Life, Richard Lovell Edwards describes the volume's first entry as exemplifying, quote, the causes, curses, and cures of this disease, ennui, in such a manner as not to make the remedy worse than the disease itself. What might be described as an early iteration of a 19th century novel, quote, having recourse to medical methodology, even where medicine is not strictly at issue. The preface clearly indicates that his daughter's tale is meant to provide the therapeutic response to the type of illness produced by fashionable dissipation and, quote, luxurious indolence. While the novel's primary diagnostic focus is trained on correcting the Earl of Glenthorne's ennui, this national tale is one of Edgeworth's only representations of the type of Irish nationalist uprisings that she would later describe as a fever that had distorted the nature on the island. In ennui, this fever of nationalism manifests as an, quote, epidemic infection, which broke out soon after with such violence as to threaten the total destruction of all civil order. One way that the Earl of Glenthorne is marked as different is his inability to recognize, quote, the symptoms of insurrection. This epidemic of infection and its symptoms are most clearly associated with another body that is defined by its difference, its awkwardness, and its appearance of mental disability. Joe Kelly, that, quote, half-witted Irishman, leads a group of united Irishmen in a plot to, quote, make Lord Glenthorne their captain or have his life. Whether or not Joe Kelly's half-witted characterizations of performance and misperception that further emphasizes Glenthorne's inability to recognize symptoms, or perhaps both, it is the language of disability here that is worth considering because it carries with it the type of threat that Davis identifies when he notes the, quote, conflation of disability with depravity. Additionally, the threat of a society founded on and by Joe Kelly lays bare the socio-political turmoil with which Edgeworth imagines a society defined by disability. As Davis reminds us, quote, an able body is the body of a citizen. In ennui, this has a dual meaning. Firstly, for Joe Kelly's reimagining of Irish society, and then for Glenthorne. Kelly's reimagining is not only characterized by its association with madness and fever, but also with violence, threatening that, quote, they would have good leaders who mustn't spake out or never spake more, and you must either head them or be trampled underfoot. The association of fever, madness, and violence creates a dangerous view of disability and, in so doing, extends that danger to the imagined world that would include or prioritize the belonging of those different bodies. Kelly's threat inverts Davis's framing of able-bodied citizenship. Only those allied with the epidemic and half-witted politics would be allowed to continue into the new Ireland. For Glenthorne, whose body is being marked as different, deformed, or awkward throughout the novel, either by his Englishness, his fashionable disease, this moment is crucial. Some of the Irishmen see him as an ally, as one of their potential, quote, good leaders, while others insist that, quote, he did not go far enough and never would, and that it was not in you, and that you was a sleepy man. The United Irishman here uses his diagnosis of ennui against him. If he is too sleepy and incapable of going far enough, then he would be cast out of the new Ireland. If he is able to shake off his dissipation, he would be a founder of the new order. This is the same premise that shapes the larger narrative of Edgeworth's novel. If Glenthorne is capable of recovering from this disease, he is granted a position in Edgeworth's utopian vision of a well-governed Anglo-Irish Ireland. If he is not, he is condemned to the impoverished life of his natural birth, rather even than the fashionable dissipation of his upbringing. For both the insurrectionary half-witted servants and for Edgeworth's novel more broadly, only those who are healthy, free of the epidemic fever of rebellion, and able-bodied are capable of being full citizens in either an imagined United Ireland or the awkward United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland. Thank you.